Muy buenos días, señores y señoras. Good morning, everybody. Aquí tenemos a la abogada de inmigración Sarah Blackwell en la estación WCCX Waukesha 104.5. Tenemos a Sarah y tenemos a Felicia. Good morning, Sarah. Good morning, Felicia. Thank you for coming here at the station. Can you tell us a little bit about, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about more yourself? Sarah, you can start.
Morning, Bernie. My name is Sarah Blackwell. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Great. And Felicia?
I am a Carroll University senior this year, and I've been interning with Sophia, and I look forward to this interview process.
Wonderful. So we'll go ahead and get started. Felicia prepared some very tough questions for Sarah. So we'll see how it goes here today. So Felicia, go ahead and ask Sarah the first question.
All right, let's dive right in. What are some of the most common myths about immigrants and immigration that you've heard?
Oh, right. Well, we've been hearing a lot of myths during this election campaign.
Indeed, we have.
One of the myths, the first myth that's most common that I hear is that these immigrants are coming into our country, they're taking our jobs, and they're using our public services. Well, we have about 11 million people here in this country illegally. Not all of them are working adults.
Right.
Some of them are children. Some of them are stay-at-home mothers. And some of them are older adults who have been sponsored by family members or come in illegally as family members. So if you actually look at those who are working, I see them in my office every day. And they're really hard-working people. And they're doing a lot of jobs that Americans actually don't want to do. So they're milking our cows around the clock, 7 days a week. And if you talk to dairy farmers, they'll say that they can't find American workers who are willing to do that job at the wages that are on offer. Now, of course, you could increase the wages to try to encourage Americans to apply, but then you're going to increase the cost of our dairy products as well. Another myth that I hear is that they're all criminals. According to Donald Trump, they're all rapists and they're all drug smugglers. Well, that's just not true. If you look at my typical clients, again, some of them will have, some of the guys will have minor criminal histories. So they might have had disorderly conduct, they might have had a DUI, and those are not crimes that I'm going to condone in any way. But they're also crimes that a lot of Americans commit as well. And if you look at the statistics, about 1 in 3 Americans has a criminal record of some sort. Now, I don't see that level of criminal history in my population, in my immigrant population. But there's also a flip side to this. And so you'll also hear the myth that President Obama, for example, has deported more people than any other president. And there is a certain element of truth to that. But there's an important thing to understand about that. The important thing to understand is that there are 2 points at which somebody can get deported. They can get deported from the interior, or they can get deported at the border.
Okay.
And what we have seen under President Obama is a shift away from deporting people from the interior to deporting people at the border. So there's been a huge spike in the number of deportation orders that are being entered against people who are stopped at the border. Now, if you're stopping somebody at the border, you're catching them in the act of doing something that they shouldn't do.
Right.
Okay. So this is where we're seeing the increase in deportations happening on. In 2015, which is the last year that we have official statistics, there were approximately 69,000 interior removal orders.
Okay.
So these are individuals who were found by ICE in the interior and they were put into removal proceedings. They processed through the immigration court, most of them. Some of them, in fact, wouldn't have been.
Right.
For example, if you've committed certain crimes and you're convicted, and those are very serious crimes, so that those are crimes like rape, like murder,
Right.
like major thefts, you get a conviction that's known as what's called an aggravated felony. If you have an aggravated felony against you, there's literally nothing that can be done for you in the immigration court, and they in fact bypass the immigration court and just do an administrative removal. We have a policy in place now for prioritizing people for removal. And in 2015, 91% of the people who were deported were in the top 3 priorities. So the top 3 priorities are: priority 1 is somebody who's a national security threat, who has that aggravated felony conviction, somebody who is stopped illegally at the border. Priority 2 is people who's got multiple misdemeanors. Okay. So that would be somebody who has got, say, 3 substantial battery charges.
Okay.
They've got a substantial battery and they've got a theft offense, something like that. And then your third priority is people who have a removal order and either haven't left the country or they've left the country and they've re-entered the country. So those 3 groups are the top 3 priorities. 91% of the removals are those 3 groups.
Okay.
So the government is actually very consistently following its own policies for prioritizing people for deportation. And we have to prioritize.
Right.
Because there's simply too many people. Okay. So those are some of the key myths that I run across.
Interesting. That's so how likely do you believe immigration reform is with the upcoming election year?
Well, I think that all depends on who we elect.
Very
Okay.
true.
If we elect Donald Trump, his vision of immigration reform, I think, is quite different from that of Hillary Clinton. Trump's emphasis appears to be more on building a wall along the Mexican border and deporting the 11 million or so people who are undocumented, as well as stopping Muslims from entering the country. That seems to be his vision of immigration. And so for him, immigration reform has a very strong emphasis on enforcement.
How effective do you think that his ideals are in implementing this wall?
I think that they're not likely to be effective at all. I mean, there's a long history of building walls to try to separate people. We already have a wall that's partially built along the U.S.-Mexican border. There's about 900 miles that's built. But of course the whole border is about 1,800 miles, so we have a lot more building to do. But as history shows, when you build a wall, people find a way to get around the wall. And you have other things that go on that affect its likelihood of success, is that it's extremely expensive to build and maintain a wall.
Yes.
Okay. And that is a cost that's going to be borne by the U.S. taxpayer. Now, we are already pouring billions and billions of dollars into border enforcement. If you look at what's going on in terms of how we spend money, Customs and Border Patrol is in charge of the border. So their budget has increased by 45% since President Obama came into office. So when you hear Republicans talking about, well, we need to emphasize enforcement, this is exactly what President Obama has been doing. He's increased the budget on Customs and Border Protection by 45%. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, which is responsible for interior enforcement, their budget has gone up by 24% since 2008. If you look at what goes on at the border, we have approximately 21,000 border agents. 18,000 of them are deployed along the U.S.-Mexican border, which, when you work out the numbers, means that we've got about 9 agents per mile along the U.S.-Mexican border. But keep in mind, we've got to do 24/7 coverage. So that works out to about 3 per shift. All right, and over a mile, that actually isn't a whole lot. You have line of sight. So you've got that problem going on with the border, that at the U.S.-Mexican border that it's a very expensive idea. That history shows us that it doesn't work.
People always find a way around.
Exactly. That they go under or over or whatever. But here's another problem with that idea, though. We know that more than roughly 50% of the people who were here illegally, they didn't cross the border illegally. They actually came into the country on a visa. That wall along the Mexican border doesn't stop them. Okay, they come in completely lawfully, and then they overstay. So some of them are coming in on visitor visas. Some of them are coming in on on student visas or J visas, actually cultural exchange visas. They're even coming in on H-1B visas. They're coming on any type of visa, and they're just staying. Now, how Donald Trump wants to deport everybody who's here illegally. So let's talk about how realistic that is. We're a huge country.
Very, yes.
Okay. And right now, if you look at the number of ICE agents that we have, and those ICE agents are the ones who are responsible for policing immigration laws inside the country.
Right.
Customs and Border Patrol take care of the borders. ICE is the interior. We have about how many is it? We have about 6,000 ICE agents.
Okay.
And we're a country of roughly 3 million square miles if you exclude Hawaii and Alaska. So that means that we have about one agent for 537 square miles.
Interesting.
So we have no idea where the vast majority of these 11 million people are. It's literally, it has to be a door-to-door search or a business-to-business search or a school-to-school search. So that is hugely expensive. Hugely. I mean, right now, we have a budget that will allow for the removal of about 70,000 people in Chiria. Those are the ones that are found by ICE. We have to take care of 11 million people. Again, this is a huge taxpayer expense.
Right. Yeah.
And it's also a huge, the whole bunch of civil rights issues around that, because if ICE finds somebody, the burden is on ICE to prove that that person is not a U.S. citizen. We have actually a lot of people in this country who don't have birth certificates. They were born here and they don't have birth certificates. They can't prove they're a U.S. citizen. And we've seen this happen in the past of individuals who are U.S. citizens who actually get deported.
Really?
Yes. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen.
Wow.
And this will happen with increasing frequency if we try to implement this idea of mass deportation.
Right.
All right, it's just inevitable. But here's the more interesting thing about Donald Trump's mass deportation idea is that the vast majority of people that he would like to deport have been here for more than 10 years. And what that means is that when ICE finds them, ICE is going to put them into removal proceedings. There is a formal process for deporting somebody. If they've got a major criminal conviction, then that process can be bypassed, as we talked before. If they've got an aggravated felony, we can do an administrative removal. But everybody else, you go through a deportation process that if you've been here 10 years, you can actually ask the immigration court for a green card.
Oh.
Now, to get that green card, you have to prove that you have been here for 10 years.
Right.
That you have a spouse, parent, or child who is either a U.S. citizen or an lawful permanent resident. That spouse, parent, or child is going to suffer exceptional and extremely unusual hardship if you're separated from them, and that you are a person of good moral character. So we already know that the vast majority of people who are here illegally will meet those criteria. The hardest thing to prove will be the exceptional and extremely unusual hardship.
Right.
But the other criteria is pretty clear that they
Pretty
will...
straightforward.
Pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
All right. So To get a green card through the immigration court, the immigration courts only get 4,000 green cards to distribute every year. And we have 11 million people, and probably, I would say, it's hard to be certain with any accuracy, but let's say 80% of them qualify for that green card.
Right.
And there's only 4,000 of them. So we put 8 million people into removal proceedings, and then we just create this very long waiting list while they process themselves through the immigration court. And here's what's really interesting. At the moment, under current regulations, once you're in removal proceedings, you're eligible for relief, and you file your application for it, even though your court date for your trial is not going to be for some time in the future, you qualify for work authorization, a social security number, and in most states a driver license. And you have those things up until the time that you go to your trial, at which point then you prove whether or not you meet those criteria for cancellation or removal. Well, what does a social security number, driver license, and work authorization sound like to you?
Citizenship.
DAPA.
Yeah, that too.
It's not citizenship, it's DAPA.
Right.
Okay? Alright. So just as a wrap up, Donald Trump's vision of immigration is going to be extremely expensive. That is going to be a burden primarily borne by taxpayers. It's also going to put at risk people for civil rights violations of U.S. citizens. Not talking about the immigrants here. And it's also going to be a very lengthy process that will take years and years and years to resolve. The only good thing will be that while we're going through that process, people have the driver licenses, social security numbers, and the work authorization. Let's look at Hillary. If she gets elected, Hillary's big problem, if she were to be elected, is that just like President Obama, she's likely to face a Republican Congress. We might swing the Senate back, but the likelihood of swinging the House back to the Democrats as well is
very
small.
unlikely. Yeah.
Right. And so she's going to face exactly the same problem that President Obama faced, which is a Congress that refuses to cooperate with immigration reform, leaving her with trying to figure out ways to tweak the system a little bit, just like President Obama has been trying to do. So let's talk about Congress, because this is where the problem really is. We have a Congress which is at the moment controlled by Republicans. And the Republican message is a very consistent one about enforcement. Until our borders are secure, we're not going to talk about immigration reform. Now, are the Democrats completely clean hands in this? No, they're not. Both parties are, in fact, from where I sit, they're very entrenched in a certain position. For the Republicans, it's all about enforcement.
Right.
For the Democrats, it's all about a family-first immigration system. Both parties, I believe, need to recognize that there has to be some type of compromise here. Not everybody's going to get what they want.
Right. Yeah.
The problem with the enforcement-only approach, or we have to secure our borders first approach, is that nobody quantifies. What does that mean? Are we seriously talking about 0 illegal entries and 0 visa overstays?
It's not very
Is that
possible.
realistic?
Exactly.
No, it's not. So if we're not talking about 0, what are we talking about? Okay. Until we operationalize that, it's really hard to have a conversation about whether or not we're succeeding. Now, I did an analysis at one point where I tried to find a crime that is more or less equivalent to the idea of either of an illegal entry or overstaying a visa. And the closest one that I came up with is burglary.
Okay.
Because burglary is an unlawful entry to somebody's house with the intent to steal something. So if somebody is entering our country illegally or overstaying their visa, that they're in some way unlawfully entering our house. And if you believe some of the rhetoric, their intent is solely to steal something from us, whether that's jobs or services and benefits, whatever. Okay, so that's the closest analogy that I could come up with. What do you think the national statistics are on the rate of burglary? Any idea?
I have no idea.
Okay.
No, I'm not even going to try and come up with a guess for that one.
It's 2,760 per 100,000 households.
Okay.
Okay, that's the rate of burglary across the country. What do you think the rate of illegal entry is?
Ooh.
Way lower than that.
Really?
Oh yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I estimate that the national burglary rate is about 14 times higher.
Really?
Than the rate of illegal immigration.
Interesting.
Wow.
So when you frame it that way, it kind of changes
yeah.
the conversation a little bit, and it makes you realize that we are actually doing a pretty good job at enforcing our borders. So so Hillary's problem is that she will face a divided Congress. There needs to be some type of compromises going on. What kind of compromises do I think would work and would be achievable and relatively painless?
Right.
So we have some laws on our books that are in fact really old.
Yes, we do.
Okay. So one of the things is that we attach limits to immigration. Now, certain immigration, there's no limits attached to it. So if you're sponsored for a green card by your spouse, if you want to sponsor somebody and you want to sponsor your spouse, your parent, or your unmarried child under the age of 21 and you're a U.S. citizen, those individuals get classed as immediate relatives.
Okay.
And we don't set any limits on how many immediate relatives can be sponsored for a green card in any given year. So if you look at the most recent statistics that we have, which is from 2014, in 2014 we issued 1,116,518 green cards. So we had 1 million new lawful permanent residents, and that's pretty consistent from one year to the next. Okay, it doesn't vary that much.
Right.
So of those 1 million green cards, 416,000 of those went to people who were sponsored, who were sponsored by U.S. citizens, and they were the spouse, the parent, or the unmarried child under the age of 21. So that's almost half. Almost half of our immigration at the moment is completely unrestricted. The rest of the people who come in, well, not quite all the rest, but a good number of the rest of the people who come in under the preference relative visa allocations and also sponsored by employers.
Okay.
So we allow 225,000 visas a year to preference family members. So that is the spouse and unmarried children of a local permanent resident. And that is the adult sons and daughters, both married and unmarried, of U.S. citizens, and the brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens. Those are preference relatives.
Right.
We have 225,000 visas for those. We have 140,000 visas for people who have been sponsored for green cards by their employers. Now, there's a couple of things that can be done with both of those allocations.
Okay.
The 140,000 for employers. At the moment, if an employee, if the person is being sponsored by the employee is married and has children, he or she can bring those children and spouse in with them as what we call derivatives. And those derivatives get counted against that 140,000. So in 2014, the employees that we sponsored for green cards came to 75,000, and the remaining of those 140,000 visas went to dependents, went to the spouses and to the children. If we stopped counting the spouses and the children against that 140,000, we would have an extra 70,000 visas, just boom, without making any other changes. Do the same thing on the preference relative side, because again, if you're sponsoring your adult son and daughter or your brother and sister, their spouses and their children get to come with them as well, as long as the children are age 21.
Right.
All right. So just like with the employees, those dependents get counted against the 225,000.
Really?
Yes. So let's imagine that of that 225,000, you've got on average a spouse and 2 children. That means that most of those visas are going to those dependents.
Right.
If we stopped counting those dependents against that allocation, we would clear up the waiting lists so much faster, because the waiting lists are ridiculous. If you are a Mexican and you've been sponsored for a green card, and you're the adult son or daughter of a U.S. citizen, they're dealing with petitions that were filed in '95. And if you're the brother or a sister, it's not that much better. It's 97, 98. And part of the problem is because we're counting the dependents as well as the actual person who's been sponsored. The other thing that would be very easy to change and would have a huge impact would be to get rid of this 7% quota. No country can have more than 7% of the immigrant visas in any given year.
Okay.
This is why we have different waiting list times for people from Mexico, China, India, and the Philippines. Because they bump up against this 7% rule.
Right.
Because lo and behold, we have more Mexicans, Indians, and Chinese here in the country who actually want to sponsor their family members. For the Mexicans, this is historical. This goes back to the 1986 amnesty, when we had about 3 or 4 million people who were granted an amnesty, and about half of them were Mexican. And as soon as they got their green cards, they turned around and started sponsoring their family members. That's not surprising. At that time, they were typically sponsoring their spouse and their unmarried child under the age of 21. The problem is that those children grew up and didn't reach the top of the waiting list before the age of 21. And so they fell over into the adult
to a different category.
to a different category. And then when their parents became U.S. citizens, they moved into another category. And they're still waiting. And the people who are been sponsored as brother or sisters, the first individuals who got the individuals who got their green cards through the 1986 amnesty, the earliest that they could have become a citizen was 1995. As soon as they became citizens, they turned around and started sponsoring their brothers and sisters.
Right.
And so that's why you see the waiting lists are just reflecting what happened through the 1986 amnesty. So, which brings us to the next point, which is that the 1986 amnesty, the mistake of that amnesty, was to not anticipate that people would turn around and sponsor their family members. In 1990 was the last time that we increased the annual quotas for preference and employment-based visas. We've been at 225,000 and 140,000 since 1990. It would be very easy to increase those quotas, but if you adopted those 2 little measures that we already talked about, that not counting dependents against those quotas, we might not even need to do that. Another thing to consider is with immigration reform is how, if we were to do it, how should it look for an amnesty process? And I use the word amnesty because it's an amnesty. I'm not going to sugarcoat that one. We've got 2 ways of doing this. We can do it through a sponsorship, saying you have to be sponsored by a family member or by an employer. That's the 245I approach. 245I being a law that sunset on the 30th of April 2001. That was the filing deadline. If you filed by that time, then you would be eligible to have your immigration interview here in the United States rather than going back to your own country. So the problem with that approach is it's tied to sponsorship, and then it gets tied to the waiting list problem. Now the 1986 approach to this problem was to say if you were here on a certain date, you can apply for a green card and you won't have to leave the country
Okay.
to go to your immigration
Yeah.
interview. That would certainly be the more sensible, the easier
Right.
approach. The other thing to consider with immigration reform is one of the biggest obstacles that we've got at the moment to people getting their situation sorted out, whether through a family member or through an employer, is the 3-year and the 10-year bar.
Mhm.
So if you've lived here legally in the United States for more than a year, that's regardless whether you enter the country illegally or whether you overstay a visa by more than a year.
Mhm.
When you have to go outside the country to have your immigration interview, you have to go back to your own country to have the immigration interview.
Right.
And that causes a problem because it triggers a law that says if you live here illegally for more than a year and you leave the country, you can't come back for 10 years.
Right.
Unless you prove that you have a spouse or a parent who's a US citizen or permanent resident who's going to suffer extreme hardship.
Mhm.
That creates a huge barrier to people getting their situation sorted out. Employers can't sponsor them because typically the person doesn't have that qualifying relative,
Mhm.
even if there's no waiting list. And for those who do have a qualifying relative, they're terrified. They're really terrified
Right,
about leaving the country. They're frightened that they won't be able to prove
Mhm.
this extreme hardship. So my suggestion would be to replace that 3-year and 10-year bar with a fine. That if you overstay your visa by more than a year or you enter the country illegally,
Mhm.
if you've got somebody who's willing to sponsor you, that's great. But you're going to have to pay a fine.
Right.
And it needs to be a pretty substantial fine, I think.
Mhm.
So I don't think a fine of, say, $5,000 would be out of the ordinary. Because right now, if you're eligible for an exception to that 10-year law, and you want to do that waiver process, it's called the hardship waiver, you're typically probably going to be spending $5,000 to get that, and people do it.
Right.
You know, so this idea that's much it's too expensive. No, it's not. It's actually
What you're already
fairly
paying.
reasonable.
Exactly.
And there have to be consequences. You know, people have broken the law. There ought to be a consequence to that
Mhm.
to get it fixed. All right. So, what other kinds of things with immigration law? Another area of immigration reform would be looking at temporary workers.
Mhm.
So, particularly in a state like this, there's a temporary worker visa for what's called seasonal labor.
Mhm.
So it covers a lot of agriculture.
Right.
It will cover like landscaping, and those, and it will cover like work in resorts, hotel resorts, which have a peak in their work during the summer months.
Right.
And it's a fairly popular program, but it doesn't help certain areas of agriculture. So, for example, the dairy industry,
Mhm.
hardly seasonal. These cows need to be milked 24/7,
Right.
365.
Yeah.
So the dairy farmers can't take advantage of that program. So we just need to make a small tweak to that program so that it no longer depends on there being seasonal variations. It's
Right.
just a temporary worker program for certain types of unskilled or low-skilled labor.
Mhm.
That would be a huge improvement
That would make a
over
huge
what we have.
difference. Yeah.
Wow.
So those are some things that I see that we could do with immigration reform that they're not particularly contentious, I don't think. You know, and they're achievable.
Mhm.
And if we could just get the Democrats and the Republicans to come together and to have a sensible conversation, you know, we could actually accomplish something important,
Mhm.
and we could help 11 billion people come out of the shadows.
Maybe we should have you as a mediator.
Right.
Okay.
Wonderful. Well, we are a little bit past 10 o'clock, so just wanted to thank Sarah and Felicia. Felicia had some wonderful questions here for Sarah, prepared for her, and that set the tone as to what Sarah could talk about. Sarah's always a wealth of information. It's always a pleasure to have you here. I haven't met any other immigration attorney as knowledgeable as Sarah is, so I always learn a lot when I'm around her. So I wanted to thank Sarah and Felicia for being here. Any last words to the audience, Felicia and Sarah?
Thank you for having us.
All right.
Thank you very much, Bernie, for having me.
Thank you to both of you again, and we'll continue with some music for you all, and we'll say goodbye to Sarah and Felicia. Thank you for listening.